portion of the ASSA conference. There are many LERA panels that are going on this 3 days, and we encourage you to check into some of the others later today and then on Monday and Tuesday. Today's panel will be looking at the issues of labor power and the effects of trade on labor power and labor market concentration. We have 4 papers that will be presented, and then we are going to follow with 3 discussants who will be looking over those papers. At the conclusion of the remarks from the 3 discussants, I will be checking through the comments from participants to get questions into the stream. During the conference presentation, you can use the Q&A, and the presenters can answer your question in written form, and they may also save it for at the end for the oral response. So if you look at the bottom of your screens, you see Q&A, and you can click there to interject and have a question. And we're going to have the session start with the paper from, I'll let them introduce themselves actually. Hopefully you see the screen now. They are sharing their screen. And Lucombo and David, if you want to get started.
Good morning, everybody. My name is David Dongo, and together with my colleague Lucombo, Joaquin Luveia, we'll be talking about the Chinese trade shock and employer concentration. And we'll begin by making an introduction, review of literature, contributions, data, interpretation of results, and then conclusion, next steps. So basically, this paper explores the extent to which exposure to trade shocks affected the employer concentration and whether the instance of local monopoly power increased commuting zone level cause of trade. So we basically use data by Otto, Don, and Hanson, which we merged with the QWI census data to compute employer concentration and commuting zone. And this actually is because there has been startling statistics over the years that has been showing a long stretch of wage stagnation in the US for decades since 1970s, at the amazement of a lot of economists and researchers. Moreover, Achimoglu and Otto in 2011 and Ben Michael 2018 find real wage growth had slowed significantly, while Karamonas and Neymar 2014 and Benemerich and et al. 2018 find that the labor share of national income had diminished. In other words, GDP paid out in wages, in terms of wages, salaries, and other benefits had really been declining since 1980s in the US. This raised concerns about slowing income growth inequality and loss of consumer spending. Besides, Michel 2012, Bivens and Michel 2015, and Ugochini 2018 noted that the nexus between productivity growth and real wages increase in terms of hourly compensation had appeared to be slowing down over the years. So the question is whether the US labor market is really competitive. Previous research had pointed to the fact that globalization had flooded the local market. And this flooding of the local market by globalization had really affected competition by local companies in terms of their products with the cheap Chinese imported products. Besides, we also, this period also experienced a phenomenon that led to displacement of a lot of workers because of technology. And this technology displaced mainly low income, workers that were poorly, that were quite endowed in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. And this displaced a lot of them. So Ben Michel and Michel really piqued interest in this kind of phenomenon. And they actually went back in time because they assumed that the research and the work at that time did not go far enough at that time. So they used industrial level data from 1977 to 2019 to measure the impact of employer concentration wages in the local labor markets while controlling for labor productivity. And to this extent, they measured local market concentration using a standard formula called the Hevindal-Hashman index. As you can see, the graph below, it shows really a pattern of growth of HHI from 1977 to 81, 82 to 86, up to 2002, 2009. And this index is one of those commonly used to measure employment concentration, among others, and it's measured on the scale of 0 to 1. And as you can see, there's a trend in growth from 1977 to 2009. And what this really means is that the higher this index, it means that the wages were quite low. So you can see that as there was a movement upwards from 1977 to 2001, 2009, it means that the wages were really slowing down, yet productivity at this point in time was high. The next figure really shows concentration of the labor market by commuting zone. And as you can see, most of the middle states in the US really had a very high figure in terms of measure of concentration, which was between 0.5 to 1. And we also had some areas measured in terms of high from 0.25 to 0.5 and so on and so forth. And you can see this was spread out throughout the US with coastal areas really implying that this index was really very low. So this really was quite startling, and the economists really were very interested in this kind of thing. So the overarching question was whether this swift rise in import penetration from China to the US accounted for most of the variation in the labor market concentration. Secondly, if really this was the case, so what was the direction of the incidence? Was it positive? Was it negative? And if the direction was so, in what form was it? And the intensity across the sectors in the US. And the question is, how do we explain for the differences in incidences across the US, across the sectors by this kind of statistics? And a brief review of literature, starting from ASSA et al., they use really a near data universe of online US job vacancies to compute labor market concentration using the HHI for each commuting zone by what they call a 6-digit COC by occupation. And then Elizabeth Weber and Matthew, they used the detailed microdata of occupational employment statistics to estimate employer labor market power by occupation for near all the workers in the US, in all the sectors by occupation, and all geographical areas from 2015 to 2017. And what really they find out was that the manufacturing industries had showed labor market concentration that was distinct from product market concentration in terms of correlation and wages in each of these sectors. The authors document really a wide variation in the extent and wage impact of explicit orgosone by occupation, and how much of that variation can be explained by various occupational characteristics. So Ben Melech et al. Analyzed the effect of local level labor market concentration wages using census data from 1977 to 2009. And they find that local level employer concentration exhibited a substantial cross-section and time series variation over time. And moreover, there existed a negative correlation between employer concentration and wages. The negative relationship between labor market concentration and wages becomes stronger when unionization rate is low. Moreover, when the labor markets are less concentrated, the link between productivity and growth and wage growth is quite stronger. Lastly, they find that exposure to great import competition from China, also known as the China trade shock, is really associated with, among others, concentration of labor markets. And at this point, I'm going to talk briefly about the Acemoglu paper. The Acemoglu paper is where we draw from, and our research really is an extension of the Acemoglu paper. So Acemoglu really explore how much of the sluggish U.S. employment growth can be explained by the quick rise of import competition from China. And as I said, our paper is an extension of that. And using employment data from county business patterns, this paper really fills out the glaring existing gap in the literature by closely examining the impact of China trade shocks on commuting zone employer concentration. Let me hand over to my colleague, Lucombo, to pick it up from there. Lucombo, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Can you please keep sharing your screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will go ahead and present the data, the main source of the data that was used for this research. Let me begin by saying that we use two main sources of data sets. The first of that is QWI, which is quarterly workforce indicator, which was used to calculate our main dependent variable. We also utilize Acemoglu et al. 2014 international trade data, which was pulled mainly from United Nations Comtrade database. So the QWI is comprised of 32 indicators, which detail variety of firm characteristics and workers demographic at different level of the geographic aggregation. I would also to say that those data were classified using two-digit North American industrial classification system and is a sector level. So we used the all US state, the 50 state, US state, including the Washington, DC. So we use 741 commuting zone. The firms, there are 5 different type of zone. The smallest one with 1 to 19 employees, and the biggest one more than 500 employees. The employment data, we use the employment stable, which is the estimate of stable jobs, or the number of jobs that number of jobs held on both the first and the last day of the quarter. Please, David. So for the purpose of which I will explain later on, we use like an Acemoglu, we use the same framework, 3 different classes, exposed sector, which is comprised of all manufacturing industry, for which predict import exposure rose by at least 2 percentage points between 1991 to 2011. No exposed tradable industry, and the no exposed, no tradable sector, which I will explain later on. To calculate our main dependent variable, here we use the FNAL Eachman index, which is is commonly used to calculate the employer concentration. So what we did, we square each of the firm type employment, and then we sum them up, and we could either multiply by 10,000, but in this case, we didn't multiply by 10,000. So it can either go from 0 to 1 or from 0 to 10,000. In this specific case, we use from 0 to 1. Please, David. So I would like to spend a little bit more time here on methodology. The methodology is similar to the one that was used by Acemoglu et al., with the exception that we adjust for the dependent variable. So our dependent variable here is the change on employer concentration, or more specifically our HHI. The independent variable, our main independent variable, is the Chinese exposure, which is the growth in export net export from China. And our XIO, which is our control variable. I will explain about the control variable later on. So this model was instrumented using the net export, US net export from other eight industrialized countries. So the first one was the model that we used to calculate the overall. This one is for sectorial. So for the sectorial, the only change here is we have our first independent variable now here changed because we multiply the first component by exposed sector. The second component we multiply by no exposed tradable sector, and our third component we multiply by let's say we have that component of no exposed, no tradable sector. Please, David. So this is our summary statistic. And I will just speak very briefly about the five main, our main dependent, dependent variable, which is employment total. We see that there's a mean of 665 and the standard deviation is a little bit large. And we see our five variable that we use to compute the HHIs. Please, David. I believe also you can skip this one. Let's go straight to the result. So this is our main table, our regression result. So I would like to explain very quickly. We have the overall employee concentration. Overall employee concentration, we don't look at the sectorial results. The period is from 1991 to 2011. It has two sub-periods, which is 1991 to 1991, 1999, and 1991 to 2011. The same thing for sectorial. And then we have the last column, which is, the last column, which is the other period, which is 1991 to 2007. So we see when we consider only overall employment concentration, we can see that there is the impact is negative. But here I want to highlight that we have control variable at the bottom, which is interaction of sector multiplied by time effect and sector multiplied by the manufacturing employer share at the baseline and the sectorial sensor division damage. So the result will change or not change as we consider more all of those control variable. So as we look at the sectorial, which is the column, the 4, 5, and 6, we see that if we consider only exposed sector, we see that the impact was negative. But as we consider no exposure, tradable sector, we see that the impact was positive. For non-exposed, not tradable sector, we don't have, although we have kind of negative impact, but they are not statistically significant. So I would like to stop here. Thank you, David. So responding to those questions that David came out about in the initial, at beginning, we see that yes, there is a clear incidence of Chinese trade shock on employee concentration. We see that the sign and intensity of incidence on Chinese shock depend on how we analyze them. And we see also that the exposure to trade with China decreased the monopsony power in sector directly exposed to trade, but increased the monopsony power in sector not exposed directly to trade, but that are tradable. Also, we see that the intensity depends on how we look, how we analyze in terms of period. Thank you very much, David. So we have some work to do as a next step. We look, one of the work that we intend to do is to look at the effect of Chinese import shock how that affects the employee-based health insurance. We also want to see if this increase or not the willingness of the company to offer more or less compensation. Thank you.
Thank you. If you'll stop the share screen, David.
Yes, I will.
And Niana and Bethel, I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs. Good morning, everyone. I'm Niania Brown, and today Bethel, my co-author, and I are going to present our very preliminary research on the China trade shock and union density. I'm going to go through the first half of the presentation, and then Bethel will present the second half. Next slide. So over the last few decades, there's been dramatic growth in wage and income inequality in the United States, and this increase in inequality overlapped with the reduction in the size and strength of labor unions, along with growth in imports from low-wage countries. With this in mind, two issues that have sort of come forward as stylized facts are that one, import competition from low-wage countries, particularly China, has decimated the US manufacturing sector, the traditional backbone of middle-class employment. And two, unions are powerful agents when it comes to constraining inequality. And so the downward wage and employment pressure in manufacturing means that indirectly, trade exposure and import competition can weaken union collective bargaining power. And this erosion of labor market institutions suggests that indirectly import competition influences inequality in the manufacturing sector. And so it is important to explore how unionization has been impacted by the China trade shock, which was one of the most significant and consequential events in the US trade history. Next slide. As labor unions have been in steady decline, skill bias technical change has been identified as a causal factor in this rapid deunionization in the US. And so state level variation in union density and the change over time can be seen in these maps, where in 1991 on the left, union density was at a maximum of 18.4% in Hawaii and a minimum of 3.1% in North Carolina. And then moving forward to 2011, the maximum had fallen to 12.3% and the minimum to 1.4% in the respective states. Next slide. So Asimoglu et al. Investigate the contribution of the rapid increase of import competition from China on US employment, comparing changes in relative employment among industries with varying levels of trade exposure in order to quantify the reallocation and aggregate demand effects. And they find that the increase in US imports from China caused significant reductions in US manufacturing employment, as well as significant suppression of overall US job growth. And so we adapt their identification strategy, exploiting heterogeneity in state exposure to the trade shock, to answer the following questions. One, what is the impact of the China trade shock on union density in the United States? And then two, does the trade shock impact various demographics differently? So on this side, we illustrate the evolution of union density for pool sectors, as well as for the manufacturing and non-manufacturing sectors for the years of analysis, 1991, 2007, and 2011. And we see that union density for the pool sectors is about 10% in 1991, and then falls by almost half by the end of the study period, sorry, to about 6%. For manufacturing, union density in 1991 was almost double the pool rate at roughly 19%, and then fell by almost half to about 10% in 2011. And then the non-manufacturing sector experienced a less severe decline from almost 8% in 1991 to about 6% in 2011. Next slide. So since our main focus is on the impact of import exposure on union density, which is a ratio of union membership to employment, in this slide we show the decomposition of the decline in union density overall, and then within the manufacturing sector. So the figure in the top left corner shows a steady increase in overall employment, as well as the manufacturing sector, before a continuing decline after 2007, starting from the Great Recession onward. And then on the other hand, we see that employment in the manufacturing sector started its decline in 1999 following the China trade shock. In terms of union membership, shown in the top right corner, we see that for overall unit density, as well as unit density in the manufacturing sector, there's been a steady decline starting from 1991. And so we use a difference operator to decompose the shift in union density, i.e. between union membership and employment. And so in the charts on the bottom, we show the decomposition for overall union density, as well as manufacturing union density for both time periods. In the bottom left corner, overall unit density, we see that for both time periods, the decline in overall unit density stems primarily from declines in union membership rather than from a growth in employment levels. 85.5% versus 14.5% for 1991 to 2007, and 74.3% versus 25.7% for 1991 to 2011. Similarly, for manufacturing unit density, shown in the bottom right corner, the downward shift is again primarily due to a change in union membership for both time periods. And we have 76.7 versus 23.3 for 91 to 2007, and 69.3 versus 30.7 for 91 to 2011. And so we want to see what import exposure does to union density when we control for different factors. In terms of literature, while there's literature on the multiple effects of trade shocks on economic and labor market outcomes, far less studies is the impact of these shocks on labor unions in the United States. However, there are a number of studies that examine the evolution of unionization across the nation. Emin et al. Studied the rise and fall of unions in the United States and describe a U-shaped pattern of unionization within the non-agricultural private sector. And they argue that skill bias technological change is the underlying cause for the ascent and descent in union membership. Similarly, Acemoglu et al. Agree that technical change reduces union membership and suggests that the increased outside option of skilled workers subverts coalitions among skilled and unskilled workers in support of unions. In terms of trade and employment, Pearson Scott find a negative relationship between permanent normal trade relations and manufacturing employment. And then again, Acemoglu et al. Find a negative relationship between the China trade shock and the exposed sector employment. In terms of trade and unionization, Slaughter as well as Baldwin find no robust correlation between unionization and imports. And then Gurun and Booth estimate a 1% increase in import penetration leads to almost 2% decline in unionization rates within 3 years. Lastly, Alquist and Downey find reduced unionization within manufacturing, but robust increase outside of manufacturing, and that the decline would have been 36% larger without Chinese imports. And so our paper extends Alquist and Downey's research and contributes to the literature by examining the relationship between the China trade shock and union density, as well as the demographic variations thereof.
In terms of data, our union membership and employment data is sourced from the Economic Policy Institute's CPS Outgoing Rotation Group. Import exposure data is retrieved from the public replication files provided by Acemoglu et al., who sourced their data from the UN Comtrade database. In terms of summary statistics, for the change in union density, there were declines over the period 1991 to 2011. Manufacturing experienced the largest decline, with the mean industry contracting by 0.44 percentage points over the period. Columns 3 and 4 show that the decline in union density was larger after the shock for pooled industries and for non-manufacturing, whereas for manufacturing, the size of the decline was larger prior to the shock, with a smaller decrease subsequent to the shock. In column 5, we noticed that the largest mean decline for each group occurred in the sub-period 1999 to 2007. Indeed, 2007 was the first year since 1979 in which union increased, according to the BLS. For our independent variable of interest, change in import exposure, there were increases from 1991 to 2011, with the largest increases in 1999 to 2007. We estimate stacked first difference models using Acemoglu et al.'s identification strategy for the shock, which is a change in import penetration, delta IP, instrumented using the change in import penetration for 8 other high-income countries. We control right-to-work status, as well as an interaction between right-to-work status and the shock. X is a vector of additional controls. So our first equation shows the specification for pooled sectors, whereas our second equation shows manufacturing and non-manufacturing sectors. Here, we have separate shocks for each sector, shown as the interaction of the shock variable and an indicator variable for the sector. In addition to controlling for right to work, we include an interaction between right to work status and the shock for each specific sector. We provide results for all races combined and then separately for Blacks and whites. For each table, columns 1 through 4, we show pooled union density across both sectors for the stacked periods ending in 2011. And in columns 5 through 8, we show manufacturing and non-manufacturing for the same period. Column 9 replicates column 4 for the stacked period ending in 2007, and column 10 replicates for the stacked period ending in 2007, it replicates column 8. We successfully add the following controls: time effects, manufacturing employment share at the baseline, union density share at the start of each SAC period, and census division controls. Here we have the specification for all races combined. We see a positive impact from the shock with significance in columns 2 and 4. This increase is larger in non-right to work states. Thus in column 2, a 1 percentage point increase in local import exposure increases overall union density by 0.89 in non-right to work states, but 0.67 in right to work states. Similarly, in column 4, a 1 percentage point increase in local import exposure increases overall union density by 1.19 percentage points in non-right to work states compared to 0.983 in right to work states. For the sectoral breakdown, the coefficient shock is positive and increasing across columns for manufacturing, but positive and decreasing for non-manufacturing. As we saw in this pooled specification, the increase in union density due to the shock is larger in non-right to work states. In column 6, the effect of the shock on the manufacturing sector in non-right to work states is 1-to-1, whereas for right to work states, it decreases to 0.72. In the non-manufacturing sector, the effect on non-right to work states is 1.089 compared to 0.128 in right to work states. And in column 8, the effect of the shock in non-right to work states is 2.512, whereas for right to work, it decreases to 1.647. In the non-manufacturing sector, the effect of non-right to work states is 0.785 compared to 0.355 in right to work states. This next table shows the change in union density for the Black population. In contrast to the positive effect of the shock in non-right to work states for all races combined, the effect here generally tends to be a negative effect of the shock. Like the previous table, the effect within the right to work states tends to be positive. Jumping directly to the sectoral breakdown, of note have the large positive and significant effect of the interaction between right to work and the shock, both within and outside of manufacturing. In column 6, where we control for time and manufacturing employment share at the baseline, the effect of the shock in manufacturing is negative 2.844 for non-right to work states as compared to 10.572 in right to work states. For non-manufacturing, the effect is negative 5.03 for non-right to work compared to 1.393 in right to work states. This next table shows the change in union density for the white population. For pooled sectors, as well as manufacturing, there's a positive, increasing, and generally significant effect of the shock. For non-manufacturing, the effect is also positive and significant, but decreasing. In column 4, which includes all controls, the effect on non-right to work states is 1.176 compared to 0.62 for right to work states. For the sectoral breakdown, the coefficient on the shock is positive and increasing across columns for the manufacturing sector, but positive and decreasing for the non-manufacturing sector. As we saw in the pooled specification, the increase in union density due to the shock is larger in non-right to work states. In column 8, the effect of the shock on the manufacturing sector in non-right to work states is 2.9, whereas for the right to work states, it decreases to 1.252. In non-manufacturing, the effect on non-right to work states is 0.854 compared to 0.049 in right to work states. In conclusion, we see that the results show a positive effect of the China trade shock on union density with varying significance, except in the case of Blacks in non-right to work states, where the effect is generally negative. The effect is larger in non-right to work versus right to work states for Blacks where the sign changes, and generally manufacturing has a larger increase. From the literature, we know the shock has caused unemployment, and one of the mechanisms being considered is for the increase appears to be greater difficulty in laying off unionized workers as compared to non-unionized workers, but we're exploring enough different hypotheses to understand what is going on in the results. Additionally, based on the Appleton and Downey paper, another channel could be second workers moving into highly unionized sectors, which will explain part of the increase in non-manufacturing. The driving factor and in a negative effect on Blacks in non-work states, as well as a large positive effect in manufacturing, merits further investigation. Similar to Alquist and Downing, we find that the shock helps slow the decline in union density. For our next steps, we will include the public sector and explore changes to employment and labor force status. We will also include further industry breakdown and a gender breakdown. Thank you.
Thank you. So Philip, you're up next, and they stopped sharing screen, so hopefully you can now share the screen.
Okay, thank you, William. That should work. No. Oops. Okay, so normally you should see my screen.
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay, so that's not the first slide. I go directly. So electoral democracy at work. So this is a joint paper with Thomas Breda. We are both researchers at the French National Center for Research. So actually, international organizations, including the IMF, OECD, or ILO, now pledge for a better balance between employers and workers, and an improvement of the quality of employment relations as drivers of business performances and inclusiveness, including a reduction of inequality. Now, these institutions, but we could say also broadly, the industrial relation literature observe large cross-country differences, but don't provide policy guidance to achieve these improvements. There is also a large literature on union renewal, mainly focuses on issues concerning the internal organization of unions. By contrast, we propose a quantitative evaluation of a specific major reform in France in 2008. So in 2008, so we have seen in the US the declining trend in unionization, union membership rate. That was also the case in France, with a very low union membership rate in the private sector, only 7% of the workers, and at the same time, employers complain about bad labor relations. So the conservative majority voted a joint proposal of the two main French trade unions and the main employer organization. Basically, this reform put an end to a form of legal cartel formed by the 5 historical unions, and now based the recognition as a bargaining agent on votes at repeated free elections at the workplace level. We estimate that this reform on the long run has significantly improved the satisfaction and trust in unions of employers and workers, and increased union coverage and union membership. So I will give you more details on this reform before presenting our data, our empirical strategy, and then discussing the results. So before 2008, we had 3 types of workers' representation. 2 were based on elections, so that's the work councils members and the workers' delegates, but in both cases with a decisive advantage for the historical unions. The collective bargaining was done by union representatives, staffs who were not elected, but appointed directly by the historical unions. So if you have just one union member and you are one of the historical unions, for example, the Christian workers, you can appoint this worker as a union representative, and so as a bargaining partner for the employee. So with the 2008 law, the recognition as a bargaining agent at the firm level, but also at the industry and the national levels, is now based on reaching a minimal threshold of vote during elections, specifically the work council elections. So that's concern only workplaces or firms with 11 or more workers. Our data are a merge of two sources. An administrative set, which provide the dates of elections for the electoral cycle 2009 to 2012. So we have the date of the election and the previous one. The second source is the response survey. So this is a representative survey of the non-farm French business. It is conducted by the French equivalent of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in order to measure the employment relations in early 2011. So that's a match employer-employee survey. Our identification strategy is based on a regression discontinuity design. Actually, at the workplace level, the law started to apply at the first election occurring after January 1st, 2009. Since the duration of the mandate of the work council is in general 4 years and can be changed, we observe early 2011 some workplaces under the new regime and some workplaces still under the old regime. So basically, I will not detail these equations, but we run equations comparing the treated and the not yet treated workplaces in early 2011. Thanks to thanks to the response survey, we can study many outcomes, and I would present here 6 main outcomes. So rather than giving you tables with numbers, I will present you graphs showing the full sample, so rather than the local estimations. So if we take the first figure, that's the fact that at least one union is recognized as a bargaining partner in the workplace. So that's, we could say, organized workplace. So the x-axis is the date of the last election, and we look in the early 2011 if the workplace is organized or not. And so what we observe is a clear larger proportion of workplace concerned by an election after January 2009. And so a gain of about 20%. So you see from about 50% of the workplaces organized if they are not still concerned by the reform, and about 70% for the workplaces or already impacted by the reform. So we can run exactly the same exercise for the recognition of 5 unions. So basically the 5 historical unions. So the proportion of workplaces not impacted by the, not yet impacted by the reform with 5 unions was relatively low, that's normal, but even lower after the reform. And that's mechanical impact of the reform in the sense that you need to get at least 10% of the votes. So that's if you have just 1 vote, 1 union member, you cannot be recognized in the new regime. So now when we turn to the unionization rate, we have a spectacular estimated impact of the reform. Here you have the unionization rate declared by the employer. So again, we have an employer-employee survey, and you see that we have this sort of 7% for unionization rate for non-impacted workplaces, and that's around 13% for the workplaces impacted by the reform. If we now turn to the self-declaration of workers, are you union member or not? We have basically the same result. That's less statistically significant, but we have also an important increase of the union membership according to the workers. Now, we are with the response survey also able to have a sort of form of measure of the trust in unions. So actually here, that's a normalized index built from different questions asked both to the employers and to the employees. So for example, do you consider that trade unions put their own interest ahead of those of the employees? Do you consider that trade unions hinder the running of the enterprise? And so on. And so we can build this standardized index both for employer and employees. And here again, we have a strong improvement of the so this measure of trust in unions by the employers. And we have, so here again, that's less statistically significant. Also, an improvement of the trust of workers in unions. A last important result is about sort of indicator of the voice at the workplace level. So that's work stoppages, so from walkout to strike, but that's mainly so walkout in the case of France. So here you have the proportion of workplaces, so according to the employer, which has experienced between 2008 to 2010 a walkout up to a strike. And here again, we have a much larger proportion of workplace concerned by work stoppage among the workplaces impacted by the reform compared to the workplaces not yet concerned by the reform. So here, that's the view of the employer. And here there is a specific question for workers. Do you have participated or not to work stoppage? And here again, you see the proportion is about twice in the workplaces concerned by the reform. So from around 10% to up to 20% of the workers who at least participate once to a work stoppage in the past years. So we were really concerned by the size of our effects. Is it plausible to have such large effects? So we have run many robustness checks. I will not detail them. And we have also try to connect our results to over observations. We may first note that our results are the sum of an extensive margin. We have more organized workplaces and an intensive merge. So now when we turn to some macro trends, here we can look at the an index of cooperation in labor-employer relations, so provided by the World Economic Forum. And France in 2008 was the worst country in the world, so really at the bottom. And France experienced a real improvement from 2008 to 2016. And as you could see, for example, so according to this survey, the cooperation is now better in France than in Italy. But maybe the most interesting point is the evolution of the unionization rate in France according to General Population Service. So I will wrap up quite quickly here. So we have a slight increase of the overall unionization rate in France, but when you are looking at the public sector not concerned by the reform, we have still an erosion of the unionization rate, while when we focus on the private sector and especially on the same sample that our estimates, we have this strong increase on the unionization rate. So quite quickly, we try to interpret these results and look at the black box. We globally observe that we have the emergence of new unions, so that's still relatively low, but 12% of the votes, that's quite significant. We have no evidence of changes in the observable characteristics of the union representatives, but maybe that's too soon. And when we are looking at the effects on trust and participation of workers, this is concentrated on what we call outsiders, so the women and the younger workers. So suggesting that globally with this reform, unions become more inclusive. So just to conclude, we show with this paper that a policy reform can significantly improve in the short or medium run historically rooted employment relations, even in a country characterized by a very low union membership. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And if you can stop sharing your screen. And as we transition, I deeply appreciate your paper since I'm the head of the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. And it's my duty to interact with all of the French unions. And that was very enlightening and very helpful, I think, as we think about US transformation. So James, you should get ready to share. Please share your screen. Okay, thank you. We can see your screen now. So you can go ahead and unmute.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your screen.
Okay, good to go. All right, so my paper, I began with looking at the gender differences and food sufficiency during the 2020 pandemic. So what we have here, these are preliminary results. So this is a bit more of a discussion piece as I'm still doing data exploration, more so than it is empirical evidence. So I'm going to run you through the data that I'm finding and kind of ask for, directions that I can take this paper in. So my original research question was, did women suffer more during the COVID-19 pandemic? A measure of food sufficiency. So my data sources, I used the Household Pulse Survey, which is collected by the Census Bureau. It's now in its third phase. I have data from the first phase. So the first phase measured the first 12 weeks of, it was a 12-week survey, rather. So I also added state level union densities collected from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So here are the data that I'm using. I have food sufficiency, which I coded as 0 if there's always enough food, and 1 if there is some change in food. So the some change can be, sometimes it's just not enough food. For some people, it's that they've changed actually types of food. So in other words, brands of foods. I have a variable for prior food sufficiency so that we can get an understanding of what happened before the actual data began collecting. So you understand where you stand during the first week. So that will be prior food sufficiency is before March 13th. Sex female is of course male and female. Work lost is either 0 for no employment loss, 1 for an employment loss, and work found is coded 0 for those who did not or were not employed or made any profit, and 1 for those who did have new employment or work for profit. So, and married, you're single or married, and then the number of children, the data is top coded at 5. So from 0 to 5. So looking at overall total food sufficiency, in week 1, 57% of respondents reported that they had food sufficiency. By week 12, that number had dropped to 54, roughly, %. So what is the change? So the question, did you experience food insufficiency prior to March 13th? So about 30% reported food insufficiencies prior to March 13th. That means about 70% were secure. They had food sufficiency. That is a decline of 13% reported food sufficiency in just over a month's time. So, were there gender differences in food sufficiency? Women experienced a lower level of food sufficiency than men in both weeks 1 and 12, but women experienced a more rapid decline from week 1 to week 12. So now I kind of want to see what those differences might be. So we look at work lost by sex. So at a cursory glance, what you see is that there's no economic significance in the difference in work loss between men and women. But there's a slight difference, so I can't make an economic inference here, but what I want to do is kind of dive in and see, is there anything that I can learn from this, right? And the reason is because as of January, women represented over half, so the majority of the workforce. And what I want to do eventually is look at the long-term effects of the pandemic on women in the job market. So work found is where we find a difference. So women are significantly less able to find work than men in both weeks. But men gain some stability or some ability to find work by week 12, whereas women, they lose an ability to find work. So we see women are, they're losing power. So I wanted to see what the difference was there. So what is the issue with women and work? So we look at marital status and work found. And what we see is that single women are less able to find work than married women in both weeks. But single women experience a greater loss in the ability to find work by week 12. There's a need to understand why, because you would think that married women would be able to withstand work loss longer than single women. So looking across marital status with and without children, what you see is that married women without children were better able to find work than married women without children. And then you look at married women, I'm sorry, marital status of women with children. And you see that single women with children were less able to find work than were married women with children. So now that starts to explain the differences in the ability to find work. So here, I applied that kind of to just looking at single women, where single women with children look to be better off than other groups, at least in the beginning of the pandemic. And single women with children tend to do worse. So I'm just looking at single women with or without children here. So measuring across race, what you see is in the first week, actually, Asian women did the best. Asian women fared best. according to food sufficiency, both with and without children. In here, what I did, if you can see, I know it's a little small, but I disaggregated Hispanic and I gave it a category of Hispanic white and Hispanic black. So there is a bit of a phenomenon here where single Hispanic black women with children actually did better than those without children. So that's an area that I'm going to key in on a bit later. And you can see that phenomena actually continues through week 12, which is the second week that I measured. And none of these respondents are the same. So this is a cultural issue. But you can see that Black women had the greatest decline in food sufficiency from week 1 to week 12. Now here is where I wanted to understand job securities as related to unions. So now I kind of have a curveball here, and I can, what I'm going to do is further look at how unions protect women in particular. So this is of course just a probit model. So I haven't completely interpreted all my marginal effects yet, but here I'm verifying that women have less food sufficiency than men, that married people, less of sex, have a greater food sufficiency than those single. Children, you have a decline in food sufficiency with children. But majorly, right here, what I see is that in states where there are higher union densities, the workers in general fare better. In other words, as measured by food sufficiency, unions seem to be better protecting the workers in general. So not just their own unions, which I found in reading Ash and Siegel. They show that unions protect all workers up to about a 30-mile radius. So here's just future work that looking at from here is, did women show better financial intelligence during the COVID pandemic? So I started looking at work there, but I can't make a true inference yet, but it tends to look like women actually did better financially than the men. So also, did education insulate worker outcomes during the COVID-19 pandemic as measured by food sufficiency? And does unionization or education better protect workers' ability to maintain food sufficiency? So that's where I am on the data exploration. So thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, James. That's all of the papers. I'm very happy to see the attendees still sticking with us. We've peaked at about 30 at one point. So if you're in attendance, please remember at the bottom of your screen, you see the Q&A, and you can put a question in. Some of the paper authors can respond to you while the discussants are presenting. And any questions that are left in the Q&A box that aren't responded to, we'll try and get to them at that time. Each of the discussants has 8 minutes for each paper. Damon has the first 2 papers, so he'll have 16 minutes, 8 minutes to discuss each. James has stopped sharing his screen, so Damon, if you had slides, you can share your screen and unmute.
Okay, great. Thanks for allowing me to participate in this panel. A bit different virtually, first virtual ASSA meetings, but I enjoyed reading the papers. I'm gonna discuss the first two papers, and as you may have noticed, the first two papers have a lot of similarities in scope, also in research design. They're looking at two different key outcomes, but so you're gonna see that some of the comments that I make for one of the papers are gonna be general enough to apply to the second paper as well. So you'll see, apologies, but I'm gonna be repeating some of the feedback that I'm giving, but that's because the papers are, very closely related. So let me start with the first paper that looked at import competition from China and the effects on labor market concentration. So I'll start off with some of the key strengths, and I think that, again, this is going to be something that's common across both papers and important for choosing research questions, is that they both look at a very important economic force that's been well studied in the literature. What are the effects of trade shocks on labor market outcomes in the US? This is been something that's been well studied and has been demonstrated to have a number of effects. It's also a well-established research design that you get to leverage using these shocks that happen in China that affect their ability to export to different countries, and using that as an instrument for what you might expect in certain regions and areas in the US based on how exposed they were to this sort of import competition at the baseline of this period of analysis. And so as the authors point out, we've looked a lot at employment, wages, and there've been a slew of other outcomes. And then there's a question about how this might affect concentration in the labor market. That's been less studied, and so that leaves a lot of room for contribution here. So I think the work is still in process and being developed, but there's a lot of potential there to answer some, add some new analysis to some very important questions. The first question first comment that I wanted to make was to encourage the authors to go into more, prior to doing the empirics, to have some discussion, a theoretical discussion of what we should expect in this context. So we have these shocks to import competition, and what do we think ex ante should be the effect on employment concentration? And should that vary by some baseline local labor market characteristics, like how competitive or concentrated the market was to begin with? And then, you might think that the effect on the local market may depend on not just the overall level of concentration to begin with, but the level of concentration in the industries that are mostly affected by these trade shocks versus those who are not. And so some of the analysis involves heterogeneity across certain types of industries. I think here you want to think through what we might expect, or is it ambiguous, theoretically, should we, are we able to make a prediction either way, or is there a certain model that makes one type of prediction in a competitive market versus one in a different type of labor market? And then in addition, what would be the mechanisms behind this expected change? So do you expect labor market concentration to go up or go down? And, you know, intuitively, how does that work? Why is that the case? You know, for example, well, no, I'll leave it there. So I think that that would be great to tie in there to help focus the audience's attention. You know, once you turn to the results, for us to have a baseline and to see whether the empirics match up with what you might expect, or whether they are consistent with one type of theory or another type of theory. Second major comment is that the primary research question has to do with the effect of import penetration on labor market concentration. And so this is a research question that you share with the previous work that you cite a lot, Ben Melick et al. In 2019. In the paper, a lot of what you discuss, most of what you discuss about that paper has to do with their other major results. So they have a number of things that they look at: wage, employment, but they also look at the effect on labor market or employment concentration. And so it's fine that someone else has also looked at this question, but it's important to tee up what we already have seen in that prior work, and then make it clear how you differentiate yourself from that prior work. So what contributions are you going to bring above and beyond what that work has already presented? And again, the fact that they've asked the same question doesn't mean that you shouldn't, by no means. So, but you definitely want to make it clear. Here's how we're similar. Here's where we differ. This is, you know, what we had. Use a different data set. The time frame different. You're going to do some heterogeneity analysis. Does that differentiate you from that prior work? You're going to use this instrumental variables approach, similar to Askenazy et al. And, you know, it's not clear to me whether they use that same approach or not, whether they just look at the correlation between import penetration and employment concentration. So, you know, that could be another dimension by which you are distinguishing yourself from that prior work. And then you also want to compare your results. So I believe that the results in a prior work is that the import penetration is positively correlated with the import penetration is positively correlated with the labor market concentration in that prior work. And your results are showing negative effect. And so you want to look into why you think that might be the case, that you would get a different sign. You may not know, but you can try to probe some possible explanations. So you have a different data, you use a different specification. So you can start to see what might be driving the difference. If you do their specification with your data, do you also get a different sign, or do you continue to get, or do you know, does your sign switch back to what theirs is, or does it continue to be negative? So you definitely want to probe that and try to tease out why you think there are these different results, why that might occur. And I have additional more minor comments. So you're measuring labor market concentration. My understanding is that you're looking at the share of the market in each of maybe 5 bins by employment size, if I understand this correctly, and then you're using that to calculate this measure of concentration. So the one challenge here is that these are sort of grouping a lot of firms together, and so you're getting a measure of concentration across firm size groups, but that mask that may mask concentration that happens within a firm size group. So among firms that are 500 employees or more, if you had the disaggregated data, you might get a different index of concentration based on whether one firm among those firms that are size 500 or more has the bulk of employees, or whether it's, you know, sort of more uniformly distributed across those firms within those groups. And, you know, for example, I don't know exactly at what the level of observation is, but like you showed, you know, descriptive statistics, one commuting zone has an index of 1, you know, which that means that there's one employer. And that might literally mean in your data set that all the firms are within one size group, but not necessarily that there's one employer. So, you know, you're going to think about how your measure of employment concentration depends on this, the data that you have. And sometimes, you know, that's just a limitation of the data, but you want to think about what that means. You might want to use a secondary data set where you have disaggregated data and then aggregate it back to firm size to see like what the differences in the index are when you have the option to disaggregate the data more, or when you have them more coarse measured by the firm size grouping. The key research design in this area is going to use what's called a shift share or Bartik instrument. Your instrumental variable approach is to take in a baseline how much import penetration did you have, and then use the change in exports or import from China to other developed countries, and use that in combination with an area's baseline import concentration in the US to get an instrument for what actually happened. So there's been a lot of research on the econometrics of this research design over the last couple of years. So I've listed a couple of citations. You know, it's always useful to you know, engage with that literature to make sure inference and other things are sort of carrying along well. And then you had an extensive literature review. I just wanted to point out there's a couple of other papers on the relationship between labor market concentration and wages. So you cited one paper by Azar et al., but there's 2 others, and then one by Marinescu et al. That also are related to this topic, that talk about employment, labor market concentration and wage patterns. So let me turn to, my time's going quickly. Let me turn to the second paper. And as I said, the papers are very similar. So some of the key strengths of these papers are shared, including, as I mentioned, that this is a very important, well-documented topic. I also appreciated the summary of the literature here. Very well done in the Brown and Goldsmith paper. And then I also appreciated that they point out, like, there are prior studies that look at the effect of import competition on unionization, and this paper is going to extend that analysis by looking at how these impacts vary by race. My major comment, again, has to do with the theoretical discussion. So before we get into the empirical results, let's talk through what we might expect. How could import competition affect union density? You know, the shock could lead to fewer jobs in unionized sectors. On the other hand, maybe workers have a higher incentive to collectively bargain now that there's this external force that is having a negative shock on the labor market. Or maybe they have a lower incentive because their firms have become more fragile. So it may be a little ambiguous. There are prior studies. The prior study that you cite found a negative relationship between import competition and union density, I believe. And then also there's a question about how might this be expected to vary by race and why? So is there a different distribution of workers by race across unionized sectors or not, or sectors that were affected by import competition or not? And so teeing up some of the, again, predicted results would help once we turn to the results to focus our attention on what are the key things that we expected or not or unexpected. And then you also look at how the effect varies by right to work status. And I think that it would be useful to, again, talk through the mechanisms through which right to work status would mediate this effect. That right to work status is going to affect the level of union density to begin with. That might limit the scope of an effect on union density. And so, but on the other hand, it also might be correlated with lower bargaining power, and that could exacerbate some of the effects of import competition. So again, there's some discussion that would be helpful. And then again, what are the mechanisms behind this expected change? In your descriptive statistics, you talked about there could be an employment change versus a change in unionization among the employed. And so we might want to know which of these forces might dominate in a setting. And then finally, I have some more additional comments. So there are a number of specifications with different controls, and the results are sensitive to those specifications. So do you have a preferred specification and why? It helps us to keep track of like, what is your preferred result, or is it too noisy to tell? Or do you think that the change in the outcomes, or change in the estimates across specifications, is that a measure of lack of robustness, or is it that this is the preferred specification, you should focus your attention on this column? And in terms of previous studies, I think that you have different, the results differ from the other study that you cited that's the most related in terms of looking at the effect of import penetration on density, union density. So why is that? Why might that be the case? And again, I cited previously the literature on the econometrics of this shift share instrument. So again, you want to take a look at that. But yeah, I enjoy reading the papers, and thanks for the chance to discuss them.
Thank you very much, Damon. And a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, at the bottom, there's a little thing that says Q&A. And if you click on it, you can ask a question. If the authors aren't able to get to it and type an answer in response to you, then we'll try, if we still have time, to get to it. Next, Naomi will be discussing Philippe's paper.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor Spriggs, for organizing this LERA session for the conference. And I also want to thank the researchers for their work and presentations. And I'll discuss Askenazy's and Breda's electoral democracy at work. I want to say first that I'm encouraged by these study results, and I'm glad to have read this article. This study offers exciting potential for expanding worker democracy during this time of increasing attacks on democracy. It has implications for public policy, the role of trade unions and other worker organizations, and for organizing workers for workplace and civic engagement. This is important for France and for the global labor movement. Now, this micro-level study examines the impact of the 2008 French reform to require representative elections at 3 levels: firms, industry, and country. And this reform increased competition among unions and expanded formal representation of workers beyond the 5 historic unions in France. Because of this competition, the authors theorized that unions had to become more inclusive and that workers' increased opportunity to vote for representatives would enhance their voice in workplace affairs. Their findings support their theory that increased democracy through voting for representation expanded union membership in the private sector and increased workers' trust in unions. It also increased the various forms of work stoppages and employers' trust in unions as bargaining partners. Now, today I'm going to highlight some of the implications that I see from this study. First, it points to the value of micro-level examinations. They can often reveal key insights that are missed in larger analyses and reveal previously unexplored options. In particular, I think an impressive insight is in growth in union membership among private sector employees, and the growing trust in unions to address workplace issues. Of course, more research will be needed to further explore social climate and long-term results. But the expansions of some of the smaller unions in gaining ground in key sectors points to more opportunity to organize workers and expand workplace democracy. Another implication is this increased access to democratic engagement. Trade unions play a vital role in giving voice to working people. This is urgent because runaway inequality, austerity measures, and attacks on economic democracy have shaped the growth of neoliberal global capitalism over the last 40 years. Unions have lost significant ground as social partners during this time period, yet have the potential to reverse this trend through worker mobilization. With increased competition among unions, workers have a greater ability to regulate the internal operations of unions, and this is important for democracy. It increases trust in unions as a vehicle for workplace democracy and strengthens the authority of unions to act as social partners. The collective voice of working people can give more workers access to living wages, provide safer working conditions, and greater influence in the larger political economies of the places that they work. And this study shows that the 2008 reform offered unions more incentive to engage workers, which seems to be expanding workers' voice. This can be seen in increased membership, workplace actions, and the trust levels. A third potential involves public policy suggestions. The historic impetus to collective bargaining was about workplace democracy, giving workers a voice to address the labor problem. And the institutionalization of collective bargaining across industrialized nations and efforts to sustain this increased the bureaucratic nature of unions. It led to a general trend where more unions are focusing on providing services to workers, and to some extent cut off the broader social justice nature of trade unions beyond collective bargaining. The study showed that the 2008 French reforms increased employers' trust in unions. This is true even as work stoppages increased and the people participating in work stoppages increased. Policies that reaffirm and protect workers' ability to choose their representatives need to be implemented and expanded. I'm thinking of the US and the ongoing battle with the so-called right to work laws, which are falsely premised on the fact that unions represent their own interest and not the interest of the workers that they allege to represent. Finally, another potential of these study results revolves around the perception of unions among workers and the larger public. Since the 2008 global economic crisis, there seems to be a general increase in positive opinions about unions and unionization efforts. Unions can and should play a large role in shaping public discourse around the value of collective worker power. And this study shows that in the short and medium term, increasing workers' voting rights increase their trust in unions. The increased competition may have led unions to work harder at building trust and motivating workers to vote for their representatives. More research will be needed to examine how union efforts changed during this time period. But the industry and national election results since the 2008 reforms shows that unions that were in positions to increase representation to maintain status, and those who had too many barriers to entry increased their representation. Some of the historic unions lost representation in key areas as revealed in Appendix F of the study. The study also shows increased confidence in women and younger workers, meaning that trust expanded beyond male older workers with more seniority and those who represented most of the union members in the earlier period. This suggests that unions stepped up their efforts to engage a broader selection of workers. The findings also show that unionization in key sectors increased despite the aggregate numbers showing little increase of membership growth. Trade union leaders must act decisively to improve public confidence. They need to make sure their policies and practices are inclusive and transparent. They need to ensure greater participation through increased member democracy and increased member engagement. They need to actively recruit in underrepresented sectors, actively organize, and address workplace and social concerns of their members, potential members, and supporters. Again, this study offers much promising potential. Collective worker power is crucial to protect democracy and disrupt trends of growing inequality. Public policy can play a vital role in making this a reality. It requires pressure to force the political will of governments and break the stranglehold of large corporations and neoliberal policy advocates. We need to protect and enhance workers' right to assembly and bargain collectively. Unions must take the lead in expanding worker democracy at work and in the larger society. This is done by building confidence in their ability to affect change. And I think this study offers key avenues for action and for further research on worker democracy and labor power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And now Professor Smythe, Andria, if you'll discuss the paper from James.
Let me share my screen. All right, do you see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I am discussing James's paper where he looks at gender differences in food sufficiency during the COVID-19 pandemic. I have to say I was disappointed that James didn't get to prepare the original paper that he was going to look at, which looked at unionization among transit workers and how that affects their well-being. I think you should still try to pursue that idea. I know you said you had some data limitations, but that's definitely something you should still try to pursue. All right, so just kind of a summary of what is going on in this paper. So again, it's still very preliminary. It's just some descriptive analyses looking at gender differences in food sufficiency during the pandemic. Also look at the probability of losing and finding work to kind of motivate or help explain some of the descriptive results that he is finding. He uses the household pulse survey from the Census Bureau. He uses data from weeks 1 and weeks 1 and 12 in phase 1 of the survey. So the findings are pretty much what would be expected. So women experience more food insufficiency, women with children more likely to experience food insufficiency, Black women, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the descriptive data that he presents is what we would expect. All right, so I'm just gonna go into some of the comments. So the thing I like about this paper is that you're looking at a direct measure of well-being. So we've seen other papers or other work that looks at the effect of the pandemic on things like labor market outcomes. But again, labor market outcomes, for example, probability of losing a job, of course, it's one measure of well-being, but it's more indirect, especially if individuals live in a state or a locality that has strong welfare support, then the effect from labor market outcome to well-being may not be direct or even one-to-one. So I like that you're looking directly at food sufficiency, which is one of the most basic needs we have. So I think you can motivate your paper a little bit more about why this research is important or different from what is going on in other literature. So, right, make sure you put a little bit of motivation in there. So the second comment I have is the Pulse survey. I think they're in phase 3 right now, and they started this in March or April, right? That's a tremendous source of weekly data. So, take advantage of that time series component. it would be very interesting to see how food sufficiency is changing from week to week. And as I'll discuss in some later slides, some of the results you're finding, maybe because you're only looking at week 1 and 12, maybe a lot of the changes have happened during week 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, right? You're going to be missing those weekly changes if you're only looking at a week 1 and then week 12. So take advantage of the time series component that you have. I can guarantee you that there is a lot of interesting patterns that you're missing if you're only looking at weeks 1 and 12, right? And it doesn't seem like it would be a lot of work to code the other weeks, to code the other weeks. So take advantage of that component. So a related point I wanted to make, so you raised the questions about whether the CARES Act made a difference in food sufficiency, but you never actually addressed this question in the paper. So I was actually looking forward to that component of the analysis. And then here is one way or area where you could take advantage of the weekly data to see if the passage of the CARES Act actually had an effect on food sufficiency, right? So you have a little bit of, relatively high frequency data there. You can see if there's any significant changes there after the passage of the CARES Act. So, so I think this would be an interesting addition to the paper, and then, incorporating the weekly data to show this analysis. So one particular comment I wanted to address, or one finding you have in the paper, you said that women are no less likely to lose their job. But there are other data sets that report that women are more likely to lose their jobs in this pandemic, right? So women are worse off on a host of different indicators. But you're finding here that women are no less likely than men. So maybe you want to delve into that finding a little bit more. And my first hunch is, again, maybe because you're only looking at week 1 and week 12. So I'm not sure how the census asked the question about whether individual has lost a job. Is it, have you lost a job in the past week, or is it, have you lost a job since the start of the pandemic, right? So maybe you can address that, see how the question is phrased. If it's just in the past week or whatever, then maybe you're missing that movement in the data from week to week. And then a related point is to, kind of bring in other findings around this topic. So there has been quite a lot of work done on, especially women in particular, and how the pandemic is affecting them. So you might want to bring in some of that research to motivate this paper and to help guide you as you make decisions about what you're doing for this topic. So you added the effect of union density. So I think you look at so again, I saw this part late. So you look at the effect of union density in a state on food sufficiency, and you found a positive impact. I know it's very preliminary, but of course that's going to be an insufficient measure, since states with greater union density may also have stronger welfare states, right? So which could be driving a result. So at the very least, add state fixed effects. But I think you would need a little bit more data, particularly if you can find if individuals work in an industrial, right, or their jobs are unionized or whatever, right? So think a little bit deeper about how you're going to bring in the effect of unions if you do decide to take it there. And then some other minor comments. You mentioned this result that Black Hispanic women, I think you said without children, are more likely to be to experience food insufficiency, and you thought that was a puzzling result that you want to take a deeper look at, I think you should start by looking at the sample size. So when you start, cutting the data, it starts to get smaller and smaller, right? And then the outcomes, again, their indicator variables is probably smaller in each category. So just look at how precise those estimates are, and whether it's just a data issue, right? So look at that first. And then two other things I want you to think about. One is how you code the data. So again, it's not right to code the missing the minus 9998 is 0. So you probably want to recode your data, all of it, right there. And then the final point is you talked about comparing the most economically secure with the least economically secure women, and you said that single women without children is the most economically secure, but you do have a married variable. So I think married women without children is likely the most economically secure. So you might want to rethink how you're ranking the groups that are most secure. So that's what I would suggest for that. All right, and I'll send you those comments.
Thank you, Professor Smythe. And just to remind those in attendance that there's a Q&A box at the very bottom, and you can press the Q&A box to type in a question if you have one. There aren't any questions still left in the box. There was an earlier question to the Dongo Lucombo paper, and it looks like the authors responded to that. I don't see any more in the Q&A. I want to make sure and thank the discussants very much for taking the time to go through all the papers. We deeply appreciate you contributing to the conference by doing that. And I wanted to remind everyone who's attending this session that there are other LERA sessions that will be taking place, and hopefully you'll look over the LERA schedule. We have another set of panels this afternoon, and then panels on Monday and Tuesday as well. All very interesting topics. And thank you to all the participants for preparing your papers and getting them to the discussants. I still don't see any questions showing up. So what I'll do is I'll let the panelists choose one of the authors to give a quick either thank you to the discussants or a quick comment. We have a hard stop. At noon, the session ends. So there isn't a time to go over our limit. So please, if any of the presenters want to give a quick feedback to the discussants or say thank you to the discussants, let's start with the Dongo paper, and then we'll go to the Brown paper, Philippe, and then James.
Okay, I just want to thank you all for your contributions and comments, especially Professor Damon Jones for your comments, which I believe are very broad in terms of what I think we needed to really hear from the audience. And we are certainly going to look at everything that you commented on and you advise us to take a look at. We are very excited that you pointed out some things that we probably did not pay too much attention to, but certainly we had them in mind. And for such a paper like this, I think it's very enriching. And so we will take that, and we appreciate all your comments. And I and my colleague will, will take that into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Professor Jones, for your comments. Definitely very helpful, and we will be looking into your specific comments. We definitely appreciate them, and I think they will help to make our paper a lot better. Yeah, thank you so much again.
Okay, I also really appreciate the comments and the perspective of Naomi. I also agree that we maybe have to give more evidences. Actually, now we have a new wave of the response survey, so we could see not the causal impact of the 2008 reform, but the sort of long-run evolution of labor relations in France, and if the improvement in the trust in union, for example, of union membership, still lasts. So again, thank you so much for your perspective.
I want to first thank Dr. Spriggs for the invite. This was actually my first time presenting at a conference. I also want to thank my colleagues. I really have picked up a good bit of inspiration in seeing how far along your papers are. And I've written down a few of your methods that I'm going to use, and some of them from the suggestions from Damon. Thank you, because some of your suggestions I'm going to use going back to my transit paper that I originally had. I definitely want to thank Dr. Smythe for just the details she took of the paper, and I'm definitely going to use the time component of my data. In my preliminary, I just kind of, was glancing over to see what effects were there and was it worth, spending the time on doing that. And I'm definitely going to continue with the transit paper. Transit is a lifelong passion of mine. I'm a former transit union employee, actually, mechanic by trade. So thank you all.
Are there any other questions from those in attendance? Again, please, you have the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and you can click on it and you can type in your question. Did any of the discussants, I'm sorry, Damon, I had you talk about two rather long and complicated papers and you got squeezed on time. Did you have some further comments that you wanted to offer, or did any of the other discussants have anything they wanted to add?
Yeah, I got to all my comments. I would have spent more time balanced between the two sets of papers, and I got a little behind on that, but I did make it through all of my comments. If anything else comes to mind, I may email the authors offline, a couple other like minor, comments on the text.
Okay, thank you. Well, did any other discussants have some comments? Any Q&A from the attendees?
I just want to apologize for everyone that you didn't get to come to Chicago and get the slushy weather that we have right now. So
it's okay, no apology necessary.
Yeah, they got rid of the 8 a.m. session, which I guess gave you a slight break that you didn't have to deal with this starting at 7 a.m. in Chicago. But I still have a little bit of sympathy for people out in California because we're starting at 7 o'clock if you're out there. And Philippe, thank you so much. The time zone challenge, I'm sure, was an annoyance for you too, having to zoom in from your location. And I hope to follow up with you, Philippe, offline. I think your work is really important for people who have not really thought through the French situation, where when you have automatic extension of collective bargaining without having to build the union density, and not thinking through why it might be important to really worry about union density as opposed to only worrying about collective bargaining coverage. I think it's a huge and important insight about what it is unions do. And so I think it's very important contribution.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if I may, Professor Spriggs, I think that it's also important from the U.S. perspective, right, in the post-Janus world and what that means for public workers and public worker unions. And coming out of New Jersey, a lot of the research has shown that public worker unions have actually gained union density in New Jersey because they have recognized the need to change their organizing efforts and to build that internal democracy, right? Going directly to what Philippe and Thomas were talking about in their paper. So I really wanted to highlight that point.
Yeah, I am also encouraged by it. I mean, we're challenged globally with a threat to democracy, little d democracy, and people need to think about the importance of institutions within protecting democracy. And they're real threats if we don't think about those institutions.
Perfectly agree.
Okay, well, they're going to fade us out in 4 minutes. I don't know if, I mean, I suppose we can all just leave now. There are no comments from the attendees. I see nothing in the Q&A.
Oh, Zachary, Sheila raised some issues regarding reverse causality, whether we really took that into account, and we just commented we're going to take that into account. And we just want to thank Zachary for raising that. Thank you.
Yes, and Zachary's question was very much in line with Professor Jones's comments to you, that you want to control at the baseline what the concentration level was. So that will help you. Okay, well, I think I'm going to free everybody up because I know you have to move on to some other things. Again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the discussants for taking the time, for the wonderful comments, and hopefully people can follow offline in communications. And one day, Philippe, when we're back to meeting in person again, and I have to come to the OECD, I hope I will have a chance to actually talk with you, and would love to have you present the paper to the TUAC during one of our economic working group meetings. We discuss issues of union density all the time. And as you are very well aware, France always shows up as the outlier because of this disparity between collective coverage and union density. And then people attribute all sorts of bad things to that. And I think your insight would be much appreciated.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Happy New Year.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you, everybody. Happy New Year. And thanks again to the researchers and presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.